In the 1,970 seconds, George Carlin and Richard Pryor were the two most important comedians in America. They knew each other. They respected each other. They were doing, in broad terms, the same thing, using comedy to say true things about American life that the culture preferred to leave unsaid. The distance between how they did it tells you almost everything about how American comedy actually works, and what it costs the people who decide to make it honest. Carlin's truth was structural. He was interested in systems, in the way institutions used language to manage populations, in the gap between American ideals and American practice, in the specific hypocrisies of a culture that presented itself as one thing while being demonstrably another. His comedy examined the architecture of the lie rather than the lived experience of it. It was the comedy of a man watching from slightly outside, applying intelligence to the gap between the official version and the actual one. Pryor's truth was personal and embodied in a way that Carlin's never was. He worked from autobiography, from the specific texture of growing up black in Peoria, Illinois, from his grandmother's brothel, from the streets and the poverty and the particular quality of life lived at the bottom of American social arrangements. His comedy was not about the system in the abstract. It was about what the system felt like from inside it, reported by someone who had no choice about being inside it. Both approaches required courage of a specific kind. Carlin's required the courage to say true things clearly, to make the argument without softening it for the comfort of an audience that largely belonged to the majority whose assumptions he was examining. Pryor's required something harder to name: the courage of radical self-exposure, of putting the most painful material of a life on stage in front of strangers and making it into art without either falsifying it or collapsing under its weight. They moved in overlapping circles. The comedy world of the early 1,970 seconds was small enough that the people at the frontier of it knew each other, crossed paths in clubs and on television, were aware of what the others were doing in real time. Carlin knew Pryor was doing something extraordinary. Pryor knew Carlin was doing something extraordinary. The mutual recognition was genuine, and it operated for both men as a form of confirmation that the direction they had each chosen was correct, that there was a version of American comedy that could do more than entertain, and that the more was worth pursuing. The costs were different. Carlin's confrontations with authority were institutional. The FCC, the obscenity laws, the broadcasting regulations. Real costs with real consequences, but costs that were ultimately about speech rather than personhood. He was challenged for what he said. Pryor was challenged for who he was. The difference is not small. Pryor's self-destruction had a different quality than Carlin's. Both men had serious drug problems. Both made choices that damaged their health and their careers in ways that took years to fully emerge. But the specific engine of Pryor's difficulty, the rage and the grief and the self-hatred that had been forged in a childhood of poverty and abuse, was something that Carlin, who had grown up working class in Manhattan with a mother who loved him and a father who was largely absent, did not share. They arrived at similar problems through completely different routes. The comedy that each of them produced in the 1,970 seconds stands as the best work in American stand-up from that decade. And it stands because both men were doing something irreducible. Carlin's work cannot be done in Pryor's voice, and Pryor's work cannot be done in Carlin's. They were not interchangeable. They were not competing. They were each the only person who could do what they were doing. which is the definition of an artist at the frontier of their form. Pryor died in December 2005. He had been ill for years. The multiple sclerosis that had been diagnosed in the 1,980 seconds had progressed slowly, and then, as the disease does, more quickly. He was 65 years old. Carlin outlived him by 2.5 years. When Carlin was asked about Pryor, in the years after Pryor's illness had become severe, and then after his death, the answers were specific and unornamented. He said Pryor had been the most daring comedian of their generation. He said the courage required to do what Pryor did was different from and greater than what he himself had required. He said this without false modesty. Carlin was not a falsely modest man, but with the genuine assessment of someone who had watched closely and understood exactly what the work had cost. The comparison that audiences and critics made between them, the two most important comedians of the 1,970 seconds, the two men who changed what American stand-up thought it was allowed to do, was accurate at the level of ambition and misleading at the level of method. They shared the ambition. The methods were as different as the lives they had led. Both of them paid for the ambition. Both of them produced work that the world is still quoting. The price and the work are not separable. That is not a comfortable observation. It is, however, an accurate one. Carlin and Pryor were on stage in the same decade doing the same thing. The thing they were doing was telling the truth about America. America laughed. Not always for the right reasons, but it laughed. And the truth was in the room. That was enough. It had to be enough. For both of them, it was.